It's already getting hot in here. Am I the only one that feels that way? I know there's some others that feel that way because I see you fanning every week. All right. We'll turn that down a little. We're talking about, we could call this many things. Jesus, the master teacher, I've called it teaching methods of the master. It has more to do with methods, though. It also has to do with frankly, his demeanor, his character, his approach to teaching and how he taught others. But certainly methodology is part of it. And we're going to spend a few more weeks on that as it leads us into our primary study of the parables, which we'll spend several weeks on, probably, I'm guessing 6 months maybe. But as we talk about Jesus and his teaching, last week we had gotten to the subject of his use of logic. We could say that Christ was the master logician. We're created in God's image, and because of that, we're different from animals. We're rational beings. We have the ability to think and to deduce and come to proper conclusions. And certainly when it comes to God and his word, he expects us to do that. So many people nowadays, of course, would rather rely upon what? What do they generally base their religious decisions upon? Not everyday life decisions. You couldn't live everyday life like this. You probably wouldn't survive. But many people make their religious decisions and what they believe about God based on what? Their feelings. It's all about their feelings. And some people live their life that way, but you can't live day to day making decisions all based on your feelings. Now, I can't just feel like the light is red or the light is green, or I can't just feel like, putting on clothes or not to go outside. I mean, those are things I have to make rational, logical conclusions about. And so we're endowed with moral sensitivity, aesthetic appreciation, the ability to reason. And our universe, as we mentioned last week, is a system of law. Many laws of science, biology, physics, chemistry. And one of the laws we have in this universe is the laws of correct thinking, which we call logic. It's the science that deals with the rules and tests of sound thinking and proof by reasoning. And to some extent or another, everybody thinks logically. Now, some more than others, obviously. But we talked a little bit about that last week, and we talked about the fact that the Bible talks about reasoning correctly. Jehovah said to his people in Isaiah chapter 18, come let us what? Reason together. Think about the way you've been behaving. We went through the book of Acts, and several places in the book of Acts, it says that Paul would do what from the scriptures as he preached to people or taught them? He reasoned with them from the scriptures. And Christianity is a religion that not only does appeal to the emotions, but it also appeals to the mind. And God expects us, as we like to say, to use our noggins. And you would expect that the creator of the universe would be an expert in critical thinking and logic, since he's the one that created it. And truth is objective, not subjective. You don't have your truth, I don't have mine. 2 + 2 = 4, and it always will. Doesn't equal 5. And if you answer 5 in school, at least when I was in school, you would get marked incorrect. I don't know about now. Maybe that's okay. If there's more than 2 genders, then maybe 2 + 2 = 4 in school these days. I don't know. But if it does, it's still incorrect. And so we see the gospel records complete with Jesus using and instructing and persuading and confronting people with logic that couldn't be assailed. And so we were looking at some of these things, areas of logic that he used last week. We talked about his argument from authority, first of all, how that On some occasions, when talking to the Hebrews, he could, because they did believe in the authority of the Old Testament, then he could reason from that authority as far as their misconceptions were concerned. So, for instance, when, as an example, and some of this is kind of going to overlap into our next study or next section of study on Jesus' use of questions. But nevertheless, we looked at Matthew 19 where they came to Jesus and they said, can a man divorce his wife for any cause? Well, Moses gave them a bill of divorcement, right, or allowed them to do that because of their immature spirituality, hardness of heart, he called it. But Jesus went to authority, right? He said, look, in the beginning, he created them male and female. First of all, he's your creator. And by virtue of that, in Genesis chapters 2 and 3, because he created them, then he has authority to tell us the boundaries of marriage, who can be married and who can separate. And he goes on to say, look, they were authorized, a man and a woman are authorized into a marriage relationship. Therefore, it's regulated by divine law. Therefore, he said, he draws a logical conclusion. What God has joined together, what? Let no man separate. He goes on to give one exception. But, there wasn't much the Pharisees and the scribes could do with that answer. They accepted the authority of the Old Testament scriptures. Therefore, they could either reject the authority or they could change their own behavior and thoughts about marriage. I think that got us to deductive reasoning, deductive logic. What does it mean when I use the word or the term deduction? Sometimes you watch TV shows and somebody will use that term, detective shows or Sherlock Holmes. What does it mean, deductive reasoning? You have inductive and deductive. What's deductive? Well, it actually means I reason from a general proposition to arise at a particular conclusion. And so Jesus would lay down particular premises that perhaps his adversaries would have to concede to, and then he would draw them to a particular conclusion that if they accepted would probably correct an error into which they had fallen. For instance, let's talk about the Sadducees. They were, for a religious group, they were a strange bunch, the Sadducees. Why? Why do I say that? They didn't believe in what the Bible says. Angel or spirit. They didn't believe in a resurrection. Well, why be religious at that point, right? Probably more of a political group than anything. After all, they were the ones in control of the Sanhedrin. But nevertheless, they had some weird ideas and didn't believe in an ultimate resurrection, Acts chapter 4 and 23. And so after Jesus had a little skirmish with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they came up with what they thought was a humdinger of a question. Based on the Levirate law of Deuteronomy 25:5, if a Hebrew male died childless, what was supposed to happen? Right, his brother was supposed to raise up offspring with the widow of the deceased. And so they came with this strange hypothetical. And they said, okay, there was a guy that married and he died and his wife was left childless. And then, 7 brothers come in and they all try to raise up children for the original guy. But they all died. Which makes you wonder if she was a black widow of some sort. But anyway, they all died, supposedly in their hypothetical, leaving her with no children. Therefore, whose wife will she be in the resurrection? Well, he gives kind of a strange, cryptic response. from Exodus chapter 3, verse 6, in which God said what? What did he say? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And then Jesus added, God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Now, when God said, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that's in the present tense, right? I am. In fact, God's always in the present tense. Because, time is nothing. He's outside of that. So, He's always in the present tense. You can go back as far as you want into eternity, and as far as you want into eternity, He's always in the present tense. He's always there. As hard as that is to comprehend, that's the way it is. So, when He made this statement, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob alive at the time when God said that to Moses? Yes or no? No. Not if He was talking to Moses, they weren't. So, how can He be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob if they don't exist? Right? Well, obviously they exist. Jesus said He's not the God of the dead. He's not the God of nothing. He's the God of something. And He's the God of the living. And so, therefore, these patriarchs still exist centuries after their bodies have turned to dust. He's still their God. So that implies, of course, the immortality of their spirits. And a logical extension of that is a resurrection of the body. The very design of human creation, differing from all forms of biological life, is that man, a spirit created in God's image, was combined with a physical body, and there is that connection that's not going to cease, because in the final day, what's going to happen? There will be a bodily resurrection. Wherever your body is, if you're dead, it will come forth and be reunited with your spirit as it awaits in the Hadean realm. Now, it'll be changed, but still there will be a resurrection of the body. And what was their response in Luke? What did it say their response was? Anybody recall? It says they were amazed, I believe. They were amazed. They were amazed because they couldn't answer Him. And so they couldn't question His logic. They had no rebuttal. And it says in Luke 20:40, they had no more questions for Him. There is another kind of logical reasoning we call, if you read a lot of apologetics, a fortiori, which literally signifies from the stronger. And what that means is it's a term used when drawing a conclusion that is even more obvious or convincing than the one you just drew. So, for instance, go to the Sermon on the Mount. Here's an example of that. Yeah.
Before you go on, when you think about how Jesus reasoned on that last one, they asked Him a question about whose wife is she going to be, and He didn't answer that question. So what He did was He went to what He knew they believed. They didn't believe in a resurrection where she was going to see these other men. They didn't believe that. And the question was tied to something they didn't even believe. And so that's what He addressed. He went right to what they didn't even believe.
Yeah, and he gave them the general truth of the resurrection of the body. He says, you err. You don't know the Scriptures. If you knew the Scriptures, you would know that there is a resurrection, and in the resurrection, there's not marriage. It's a different realm. But he started with the general because, as you said, they didn't believe in a resurrection, so he started with that. He didn't answer the question, oh, she'll be so-and-so's wife, or she won't be anybody's wife, because they didn't believe in a resurrection. So he went, as you said, to the heart of the problem, which was the general proposition that there will be one. Look at Matthew chapter 6. About verse 19. And he cautions against our obsession over material objects to the point of anxiety, right? All through that chapter, he's talking about our desire for the material. Don't lay up treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and thieves break through and steal, so forth. And then he says in verse 25, do not worry. And again, as I mentioned before, you need to keep this command in context. Sometimes we make people feel bad because we say, well, now worry is a sin. Well, okay, now wait a minute. You can be concerned. There are things that cause legitimate concern, okay? But in this context, what does he say don't worry about? What are we not to be concerned about as Christians or as God's creatures? Material things, our material, anything of the material of this world. That's not to say there aren't legitimate things to be concerned about, but you're not to be worried about these kinds of things. And literally he says, stop your habitual worrying is what the Greek says. But notice the argument. What is the argument that he makes that then forces you to an even stronger conclusion? Don't worry about your life, what you're going to eat and drink, your body, what you're going to put on. What? Look at verse 26. Here's the argument. Look at the birds. They don't sow, they don't reap, they don't store in barns. God feeds them. Look at verse 28. What about the flowers? The lilies of the field, how they grow. They don't toil or spin. And yet Solomon wasn't arrayed like one of them. And look, they're here today and gone tomorrow. So what's the argument? You've got this argument, which is true. The birds aren't worried. The flowers aren't worried. God takes care of them. What's the stronger argument then? What are we to draw from that, from his logical reasoning? Well, if God's going to take care of birds and flowers and plants, he's going to take care of those in his own image, right? We're of more value than they. He uses a similar type argument in Matthew chapter 7. When he starts talking about prayer, look at verse 7. Ask, seek, knock. Literally, he says, keep on asking, keep on seeking, keep on knocking, and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds. To him who knocks it will be opened. Now notice, here's the argument. Here's this a fortiori argument. What man is there among you, if his son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks you for a fish, you're going to give him a snake? If you then, being evil, that is, comparatively speaking, compared to God. Now, we're parents. There's a lot of parents in here. You care about your children. Your child comes to you and says, I'm hungry. You're not going to give him a stone or a snake, right? So, what's the argument? If you, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more? There's even the stronger case. How much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those that ask him? See, that's an even stronger argument. We as earthly parents take care of our children. How much more will God take care of us? Here's an interesting one. Turn over to Luke chapter 23. Jesus is on his way to the cross. Look at verse 26. Now, as they led him away, they laid hold of a certain man, Simon a Cyrenian, who was coming from the country, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it after Jesus. They laid the cross piece on him. And a great multitude of the people followed him, and women who also mourned and lamented him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For indeed the days are coming in which they will say, Blessed are the barren, wombs that never bore, and breasts which never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. Now stop right there. We'll get to the next verse in a minute, which is the point. But first of all, tell me what Jesus is talking about here. What is the context? He's on his way to the cross. These women are mourning about what they're about to do to him. And he says, I wouldn't spend too much time crying for me. You better start crying over your children, because why? What's going to happen? Yeah, in 40 years, this nation's going to be judged for what they're doing today. And the Romans are going to come, and they're going to spend 4 years invading the land, and they're going to spend several months besieging Jerusalem, and over 1 million people are going to die, and women are going to eat their children, and they're going to completely destroy the city. And it's going to be terrible. Now that's the context. So look at this cryptic saying that he gives them. This is our argument. This is his argument. For if they do these things in the greenwood, what will be done in the dry? Now that's a weird proverbial statement. Well, I think most of us know the difference between the uses of green and dry wood, do we not? How many of you have a wood-burning stove or a fireplace? What kind of wood do you use? Green or dry? You use dry. Green's not very good for burning. Well, who's the green wood here? Who's the green in his proverbial statement, in this argument? Jerusalem's the dry. Jesus is the green. He's the sinless, precious Son of God, undeserving of what he's getting. But the dry wood, that's the flammable state of most of the Hebrew people at this time. The populace. I like what one commentator said, the sap of sacred devotion had dissipated from these people. They were dry spiritually. A Jewish commentator, Alfred Edersheim, said, For if Israel has put such flame to, quote, its green tree, Jesus, how terribly would the divine judgment burn among the dry wood of an apostate and rebellious people that had so delivered up its divine king and pronounced sentence upon itself by pronouncing it upon him. So see, he says, the argument is, look, if you're going to burn, so this is the a fortiori argument. If you're going to burn green wood, which is me, how much more is the dry wood going to burn, which is you? And that's what the statement means.
I can kind of see maybe even a comparison to the tree of life, and being the tree of life. Green trees are living and dry trees are dead.
That's a good point. And he is the tree of life. And trees that are alive are obviously being nourished with water. They're certainly not dry. Any tree that's bringing forth fruit, any tree that's green, has green leaves on it, is green inside, as we say.
Brother Greg, could you spell this argument? I heard it, but I don't know how to spell it.
All right, can you spell A?
Okay.
space, Fortiori. It's a Latin phrase that means from the stronger. There's another Latin phrase, ad hominem arguments, means to the man. It's usually used to expose inconsistencies, not so much to use to prove things, but logically to expose inconsistencies. Go over to Matthew 12. Jesus cast a demon out of a man. And what was the leader's response to his casting out this demon? Look about verse 22 and following. Oh, the Pharisees heard it. They said, "This fellow does not cast out demons except by Beelzebub, the ruler of the demons." Well, really? Well, that seems inconsistent. Jesus, knowing their thoughts, said to them, "Every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation. Every city or house divided against itself will not stand. If Satan cast out Satan, he is divided against himself. How then will his kingdom stand? And if I cast out demons by Beelzebub," now notice his argument, "by whom do your sons cast them out? Therefore they shall be your judges." Well, he's not saying that their sons could actually cast out demons, but he's saying even if they could, they can't, but even if they could, what? I can actually do it, and you're telling me I'm doing it through the power of Satan? How's his kingdom going to stand? He's showing their inconsistency. He's exposing their inconsistencies. Logically, your exorcisms are phony. Mine's not. How can you say it's from the devil or Beelzebub? Well, he uses the same kind of argument in Luke 14. There's a bunch of people, a lot of crowds around him. Look about verse 25. Talks about the cost of discipleship. You know, you've got to be willing to love him more than anyone else. Put him first in your life. And notice the examples that he gives. Which of you, intending to build a tower, does not do what? What do you do first? Somebody says, "Well, I'll follow you anywhere." Well, now wait a minute. What do you got to do first? If you're going to build a tower, you got to figure out whether you got enough to do it, right? You might lay a foundation, not be able to finish. Or what king going to war doesn't determine whether or not he can meet the man whose army is greater or bigger? You have to count the cost. These people were superficial, and that's the point. He knew, because he knew what was in man, he knew that many in these throngs were superficial. And so he was trying to expose their inconsistency. In fact, on one occasion, he even said, "You're just following me because of what? You just came for what? The loaves and the fishes, right?" People do the same thing today. The big church on the corner, is going to provide breakfast, and then they're going to entertain you and all that kind of stuff. You're coming for the wrong reasons. And so he uses this kind of argumentation to expose their inconsistency. So his use of logic, which also really dovetails into his use of questions. It's amazing when you read the gospel accounts how much of these accounts are made up of questions and answers. One commentator said there's over 125 questions and answers in just the gospel according to Matthew alone. But maybe that's not surprising. How much of our Bible discussions, you think about today, how much of our Bible discussions revolve around questions and answers, right? When we got questions, we're looking for answers. And so we get a lot of that in our classes, or even when we're just talking with one another. Lots of questions and answers. And here's the thing about Jesus. He was master of both the question and the answer. Now that's the thing about it. It wasn't just his, when I say Jesus' use of questions, I don't mean just his asking them, I also mean him answering them. There's things we can learn about how he asked them, but also how he answered them. Questions come in a considerable variety. Some are worthy of a response, some are not. You have to determine motives sometimes. There's also a fine art in either answering or ignoring, or how you ask them. What's a rhetorical question? What does that mean? If I ask a rhetorical question, huh?
Not looking for an answer.
Yeah, I probably ask a lot of those in here, right? A rhetorical question is I'm asking it without expectation of an answer. The questioner is trying to impress a truth, really by just putting it in a more stimulating format, trying to get people to think without just stating a bare fact. That's what a rhetorical question is. That's one type. What's a leading question? Use those a lot if you're a lawyer. What's a leading question? Yeah, the answer's in the question. And those you got to be careful of. Because the lawyer's trying to getting you to say something and agree to something that's in the question. So you have to be careful with leading questions. And a lot of times leading questions, well, for instance, a leading question would be something like, well, isn't it true that, you did such and such? Well, with a leading question, you're only asking for what? A yes or no answer, right? And generally, you're trying to elicit a yes answer. There are informational questions, right, where I'm just asking for information. Soliciting information. Jesus came to Bethany when Lazarus died, John 11:34, and what did he ask when he got there? What did he ask? Anybody remember? When he got to town. Where have they laid him? Well, that's simple enough. That's a question just designed to elicit information. We ask those kinds of questions all the time. Which way is such and such? How do I get to whatever? What did you do with your blank? Questions designed to elicit information. Some commentators have actually surmised that he knew where they laid him and he just asked the question for the benefit of others. I don't know that we should assume that every time Christ asked a question, he knew what the answer was. He did not continuously exercise the full range of his divine powers while he walked this earth. Otherwise, how could we say that he was tempted in all forms like we are if he didn't behave and act like a human? Well, for instance, did Jesus walk on water? Did he walk on water every time he wanted to go across the lake? Did he feed 5,000 people with just a few loaves and fishes, and 4,000 people? Do you think that he did that every time he got hungry? Well, I think I'll just whip up some grub from, this one loaf of bread, and every time me and the apostles get hungry, I'll just whip it up miraculously. No, he didn't do that. That's right. He wouldn't have needed support from those women either to support his ministry. No, he didn't do that. So just because he asked for information, that doesn't necessarily mean he already knew it. His supernatural knowledge, self-limited, so that he could experience true humanity. Now, he did know about some things supernaturally. We know that. Well, here's another good example. He approached a fig tree and he didn't know it was bearing a fruit, did he? Said he was what? What does the Bible say about his reaction? When he saw the tree, he was hungry, it had leaves, it was at that point, it indicated, there was indications on that tree that it should have had fruit. But when he got there, it didn't have fruit, and what does it say about it? What was his reaction? He was surprised. He was surprised it didn't have fruit. In Mark 6:6, he was startled at the unbelief of some, and yet in Matthew 8, he was astonished at the faith of others. So, in Mark 13, it says he didn't know the time of his second coming. Now, I don't read that verse to indicate that that's necessarily true right now, but he didn't then, in his self-limitation on this earth. He was God in the flesh, but he emptied himself of the independent exercise of those qualities, and at times he operated within the normal sphere of human knowledge. And so he would ask questions just to elicit information. Teaching questions are sometimes called didactic questions. One commentator said that Christ asked 225 different questions during his ministry. And they weren't designed to be trivial either. They were designed for his auditors to arrive at truth for themselves. So, questions may be used to answer questions, right? Why would I answer a question with a question? Somebody asked me a question. Why would I ask them a question?
It engages people more in the information, and when you engage people more, then they retain more.
Yeah, absolutely. If somebody asks you a question, that's really kind of the design, I think, about some of the part of the design behind what's the personal evangelism material I'm thinking about? Not what we're using right now, but Search for Truth. Has a lot of questions. In fact, you're taught in those classes to what they call generate interest by not answering people's questions immediately. You go to the door, let's say you go to somebody's door, you're door knocking and you just want to get them interested in perhaps a study or whatever. And invariably this happens. It's happened to everybody. You go to somebody's door and they say, well, what do you think about X? What do you think about Revelation chapter? It's usually something like that, right? What do you think about this or that? Or y'all are the people that you don't believe in instrumental music. Why? Tell me about that. All right? So you stand there and you give some long explanation about how the Bible doesn't authorize instrumental music. What happens after that? Your encounter's over. Because what? You've satisfied their curiosity, right? You've answered their question. They may accept it, they may not, but you've asked their question and then they're through with you. So be on your way. Get off my doorstep. Well, that's an interesting question. And you could respond a lot of ways. That's an interesting question. Why do you ask that? Or would you like to study that? Or something. You do something to try to generate interest so that you don't kill the confrontation on the very beginning. So, as somebody said, people retain what they learn. You're going to retain more if you learn it for yourself than you're just told it. Right? And so that's one reason we answer questions with questions. That's one reason Jesus did it. It's also a good way to avoid arousing another person's prejudices and anger. I mean, if he asks you a question and then you ask him a question, It's going to be hard for him to be offended by his own answer. Well, we'll pick up here and see how Jesus used that technique next week.